When the HOA torched my old paddleboat, I figured it was another petty stunt, some self-important tantrum about community standards or visual clutter. But when they called the cops on me for the charred remains, accusing me of dumping debris on common property, that's when I knew they didn't just cross a line. They lit the match on the wrong dock. Because what they didn't know, what Karen and her clipboard never bothered to check, is that the lake they thought they controlled belonged to me. Every ripple, every dock, every inch of water. This wasn't just about a paddleboat anymore. It was about property rights, trespassing, and a neighborhood HOA that was about to learn the hard way. If you're going to burn what floats, you better know who owns the lake it rests on. Owning a lakefront cabin wasn't about showing off. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't part of some luxury retreat package. My cabin was simple, rustic, the kind of place that creaked when you walked inside and smelled like old cedar and firewood even in the summer. It had been in my family for decades, passed down from my uncle who bought the land back when it was just open forest long before the HOA-built homes popped up around the Eastern Bend. He left me the property, and I kept it just the way he had, private, quiet, and clean. The dock he built was still sturdy. The pine trees he planted stood taller every year. And the old blue paddleboat tied to the dock. That was his, too. That boat had no value to most people. It was sun-bleached, paint faded from navy to sky blue, and one of the seats had a crack that made it look like it had a permanent smile. But it worked. I'd take it out every now and then, just to hear the gentle slap of water against the hull. It wasn't about going anywhere fast. It was about the rhythm, about watching the ripples spread behind you and forgetting time existed. That paddleboat was a memory. So when I pulled up to the cabin one Friday evening and saw what was left of it, a black, melted hull and scorched ropes still tied to a smoldering dock post, I felt my throat close. Someone had set it on fire, and they'd done it deliberately. My first call was to the fire department. They confirmed a neighbor had called and smoked the night before. By the time a fire crew got there, it was out. Nothing left but ash, melted plastic, and smoke drifting across the lake. They thought it was accidental. Electrical, maybe, but I didn't have anything electrical out there. That boat didn't run on anything but feet and silence. And then came Karen. She showed up the next morning. Karen was the HOA president of the nearby development, a group of homes across the narrow gravel road from my property. Fancy ones, with bright vinyl fences and matching solar lights and a taste for order. Karen loved rules more than oxygen, and the first thing she said, standing smugly in my gravel drive, wasn't sorry about the fire or hope nobody was hurt. It was glad that thing's finally gone. Eyesore didn't belong on shared shoreline anyway. Histoire de rire. What did you just say? She smiled like she was posing for a picture. You know, several residents have complained. Your little boat was deteriorating, violated the aesthetics clause. Honestly, I was going to send another notice. I clenched my jaw. That's not your shoreline. And that boat was mine. Oh, come on, she said, waving her hand. It wasn't registered. It was abandoned junk. Trash, really. I took a breath. You're saying this was HOA action? Karen blinked, realizing she may have said too much. I didn't say that, but it was a fire hazard. And the dock technically touches the lake, which makes it complicated. Complicated? I asked. She stepped back. Maybe next time, store your trash somewhere safer. And then she walked off like nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the day examining the damage. The boat was destroyed, melted into the dock, pieces of it scattered like a crime scene. The rope had burned partially through before the fire stopped to the waterline. I found a burned pamphlet wedged under one of the dock posts. It was an HOA newsletter, half charred, but readable enough to see the words "Clean Up Initiative Unauthorized Vessels" and "Encouraging Compliance." It didn't take a detective to figure out what happened. But that wasn't the worst part. That came when I got a knock on my door from the sheriff's deputy. He introduced himself politely, said he was responding to a call about hazardous debris on community access property. I stared at him. You're kidding. No, sir. HOA president said someone's left burnt wreckage in the lake area and might be refusing cleanup orders. You mean the boat someone lit on fire? My boat. On my dock. The deputy raised an eyebrow. Can I see proof of ownership? I went inside and pulled out a manila folder I'd kept since the day my uncle died. Deed papers, survey maps, utility records, tax statements. I handed them over. He spent a long time reading. "Wait," he said. "This lake is an HOA." I shook my head. "Nope." He traced the boundary line on the plat map. "And this shoreline, this whole dock, it's yours." "Correct." He scratched his chin. "Well, that changes things." Turns out, the HOA had been calling in complaints about the lake for years, assuming it was part of their jurisdiction. They'd fined residents for using the boat, sent notices for parking kayaks improperly, tried to regulate dock lighting. None of it was legal, because the lake, the dock, the access trail, all of it belonged to me. Karen didn't just burn a paddle boat. She declared war on land she didn't own. The deputy apologized and gave me his card. "If you want to file a report, I'll log it under criminal mischief. Maybe arson if you've got any proof it was deliberate." "I've got more than proof," I said. "I've got ownership." He nodded. "Then I'd recommend a lawyer." I already knew who I was going to call, because this wasn't about a boat anymore. This was about someone believing they could rewrite reality with HOA stationery, enforce control over what they never earned, and call the law on the very person who was the law in this case, the deed holder. I walked back down to the dock, stood over the blackened boards, and looked out at the water. My water. Every ripple, every cattail, every fish swimming under the surface. It all lived in a lake that Karen thought she ruled with a meeting agenda and a clipboard. But what she didn't know, she just burned the wrong man's property. And now, she was about to drown in consequences. You don't own a lake without paperwork. And I had plenty of it. That Monday, I drove into town and sat down in the office of my lawyer, Leland Graves, a quiet, no-nonsense kind of man whose entire personality revolved around property law, coffee, and holding corrupt people accountable with the weight of the county code book. He listened without interrupting as I told him about the paddle boat, the fire, the HOA citation, the sheriff's visit, and, most importantly, Karen's smug line. Glad that thing's finally gone. When I was done, he blinked twice and leaned back in his chair. "Let's ruin them," he said flatly. "First step, confirm everything officially." Leland and I headed to the county water board. We sat down with a zoning officer named Kathy who pulled up the GIS maps, survey filings, and water rights documents. She clicked around for a while, then turned her monitor to face me. "Your family filed this deed in 1973. Your uncle renewed the private riparian rights in 1996. It's still listed under your name as sole owner of lakebed and adjacent shore." She paused. "You own the water body. The HOA owns nothing." She printed 3 stamped copies of the documents. Leland added, "This gives us leverage. Their entire operation hinges on the illusion of control, but they've never had legal access to regulate this shoreline." With the ownership question now locked beyond doubt, Leland helped me file 2 key actions. A police report for arson, citing criminal mischief, property destruction, and potential coordinated HOA involvement. A legal demand letter, sent to the Ridgeview HOA and Karen personally, notifying them of unauthorized entry onto private property, destruction of personal assets, false citation of non-HOA member, abuse of emergency reporting, and future liability if they continued to assert authority. We also included photos of the burned boat, witness statements from the firefighters, and a timeline of past HOA notices I had received, none of which were enforceable. I spent the next 2 days speaking to every nearby resident I could find. Not everyone wanted to talk, but some did. A retired couple living down the road told me they'd seen 2 teenagers in reflective vests near my dock the night of the fire. They weren't sure if it was HOA volunteers or hired hands, but they remembered a pickup truck idling near the edge of the lake well past 10 p.m. Another neighbor, a young father who'd recently joined the HOA, admitted Karen had called the boat an ugly safety hazard in several meetings. She claimed it wasn't a real vessel and posed a visual disruption to community serenity. He said he didn't vote on anything, but that cleanup was mentioned more than once. Leland compiled it all. He stacked the printed emails, statements, maps, fire reports, and citations into a thick binder with one word on the front: ownership. Then he fired off one more letter, a notice of preservation of evidence, demanding the HOA retain all communications related to lakefront activity, cleanup initiatives, citations, and property discussions. Why? Because if we ended up in court, and we didn't want Karen claiming she deleted her records because they didn't seem relevant. This was the legal version of kicking the hornet's nest. And it worked. 3 days later, we got a reply. Not from Karen directly, but from the HOA's legal counsel. The letter was defensive, vague, and full of passive voice. It stated that the HOA regretted any confusion about shared access. They understood the property was in dispute. The boat was visibly damaged and unregistered, and therefore possibly abandoned. Any removal or incident was likely unofficial volunteer action, not board-sanctioned. And finally, that they hoped for amicable clarification. Leland read the letter, tapped his pen once, and smiled. They're scared. We responded immediately. Leland reminded them in writing that there was no ambiguity in ownership. The lake was deeded, documented, and confirmed by the county. The HOA had zero rights to issue citations, touch dock property, or enforce visual standards on non-member land. Any actions taken on my property, volunteer or not, were still trespass, vandalism, and possibly arson. We gave them a deadline: public apology, reimbursement for damages, and full written acknowledgement of lake ownership, or we sue. That's when Karen broke her silence. Instead of a formal statement or apology, she called a community town update in the HOA clubhouse and made the biggest mistake yet. She doubled down. Someone recorded it. I didn't attend, but the video was sent to me by 3 different people within an hour of the meeting ending. There she was, in her usual beige vest and clipboard, standing behind a podium like she was announcing a school bake sale. She said the boat was an unattractive safety hazard, that it had been left unmoored and neglected, and that the HOA had received complaints for years. Then she claimed that my dock sat on a historically shared access zone. And finally, unbelievably, she said this: if someone won't maintain their property in a way that reflects our community values, then sometimes nature or time takes care of it for us. That clip went semi-viral in local groups. One neighbor replied, "Did Karen just confess to arson?" Another wrote, "Bold move for someone getting sued." Leland sent one final notice, this time not a warning, but a pre-litigation package. We included the recorded video, an updated property assessment with value of damaged personal property, a formal request for HOA insurance carrier details, and a line that read, "Failure to comply will result in full civil litigation and a formal report to the state HOA Compliance Board." We weren't bluffing, because the HOA hadn't just burned a boat. They'd lit a match under their entire authority, and it was about to go up in smoke. Karen didn't know it yet, but she had just volunteered her entire HOA to become a cautionary tale. The moment that video from the clubhouse meeting surfaced, the one where she tried to rationalize the destruction of my paddleboat by suggesting that nature or time takes care of eyesores, it stopped being about petty community politics. It became a civil case. And not just any case. This was about destruction of private property, public defamation, and false citation by a board that had no jurisdiction. So I filed a lawsuit. Leland and I walked the paperwork straight into the courthouse that Friday. Civil complaint for damages. Filed under destruction of personal property, defamation, trespass, and unlawful interference, intentional infliction of emotional distress, negligent governance. Named defendants: Ridgeview Lake Estates Homeowners Association, Karen Wellington, Acting President, John L. Radner, Board VP, Samantha Blythe, Treasurer, Jane Does 1 to 3, placeholders for any HOA volunteers involved in the actual destruction. We asked for $250,000 in damages, and we meant it. By Monday morning, the county clerk's public case records updated. Anyone who searched Ridgeview Lake HOA saw the case at the top of the docket. By Tuesday, the news vans arrived. Channel 5 led with Lakefront Cabin Owner Sues HOA after Paddleboat Burned, claims entire lake is his. That was followed by Channel 8's version. HOA targets unattractive boat, didn't realize owner controlled the lake. Karen tried to keep things quiet, but the media didn't care about her silence. They cared about the headline. One of the first images to circulate was a before and after shot of my boat. On the left, a peaceful photo of it tied to the dock at sunset. On the right, the scorched shell collapsed onto a charred plank. The caption? This boat sparked a lawsuit and a neighborhood war. Karen's response? A 2-sentence email sent to HOA members. We are aware of recent developments. The board will issue a joint statement soon. That joint statement never came because the board was falling apart from the inside. Leland subpoenaed emails, meeting notes, and surveillance from HOA common areas. And what we found painted a picture even worse than we imagined. Karen had emailed the board saying my boat was a blight on lakefront visibility. Samantha, the treasurer, had replied, "Let's get rid of it. If no one's using it, it's basically trash." Another member responded, "Do we have to ask legal? Or can we just have Ryan's boys handle it quietly?" Karen replied with a single sentence. "Handle it. The lake doesn't belong to him." Boom. Right there, in writing. Intentional sabotage built on a lie. They didn't just fail to verify ownership, they ignored it. Worse, they acted on a fantasy and called it law. The emails were leaked, not by us, but by a fed-up board member who quietly resigned and forwarded the thread to a local reporter. Now the headline wasn't just about a burned boat. It was about board corruption. HOA board members discuss illegal property destruction over email. Lawsuit claims deliberate sabotage. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was everybody's problem. Residents began showing up to HOA meetings with copies of my lawsuit in hand. Some brought printed screenshots of the emails. Others came holding handmade signs like, "Karen, you burned more than a boat. We want a board that reads deeds, not in our name." A video surfaced from one meeting where a resident shouted, "You cost us how much in legal fees?" Another yelled, "This is why my dues went up." Samantha, the treasurer, tried to explain that insurance might cover the defense. Might. Karen sat stone-faced the entire time. The HOA's insurance carrier sent a letter within days. Due to findings of intentional misconduct and lack of governance oversight, this incident may fall outside of insurable coverage. Translation? They were on the hook, personally. That changed everything. Board members started jumping ship. First, the VP resigned via group email, citing personal reasons. Then the secretary stepped down, saying she didn't sign up for lawsuits. Even Samantha, who had signed off on the cleanup funds, ghosted an entire meeting and was later seen packing her garage into moving boxes. Karen held out, but not gracefully. She issued a weak public comment. "I acted in the best interest of the community and regret any confusion." But confusion wasn't the issue. Fire was. And the fact that she called the cops on me after starting it, figuratively and literally, made the community furious. The final nail came when the fire report confirmed the presence of accelerant residue on the dock planks. This wasn't a slow rot or freak accident. It was ignition. Someone had poured something flammable, likely lighter fluid, and lit the boat up on purpose. We submitted the report as supporting evidence in the civil case. And while the sheriff's office said they couldn't yet charge Karen directly, the implications were clear. It happened on private land. She was behind it. And now, she dragged the whole HOA into the fire with her. A week before the court date, Karen made her final public appearance. Not in a meeting, not in an apology. She was caught on camera outside the HOA office, screaming at a neighbor for filming her. The video ended with Karen yelling, "This whole thing is fake. He doesn't own the lake." That video hit 100,000 views in 3 days. It became a meme in local forums. They called it Lake Denial Karen. By the time we walked into the courtroom, the outcome was already tilting. We had ownership documents, legal confirmation from the county, fire reports, email chains, video footage, a police report, and a digital footprint Karen could never scrub. Karen had a lawyer, a clipboard, and a mountain of denial. And soon, she'd have something else. A judgment. You'd think after being hit with a civil lawsuit, caught on video implying arson, and publicly exposed for falsifying lake ownership, Karen might have backed down. You be wrong. Because Karen wasn't just wrong, she was convinced she was right. So, in what I can only describe as a final act of self-sabotage, she tried to flip the script. She filed a counterclaim accusing me of fraud. Her logic? That I had intentionally misled the community about my ownership of the lake. That my deed filings were outdated. That I lied about property lines for personal gain. And finally, this was real, that I had provoked unnecessary litigation and weaponized public perception to damage her reputation. Leland, my lawyer, barely blinked. This is the legal version of throwing wet spaghetti at the wall, he said. She's hoping something sticks before the ship sinks. We filed a motion to dismiss the counterclaim. The court scheduled a hearing, and Karen showed up. It was the first time I'd seen her in person since the Paddleboat fire. She looked tired, nervous, but the clipboard was still in her hand, like some sad piece of armor. Her lawyer tried to argue that I had manipulated zoning maps and had never actually used the lake until the HOA brought attention to it. The judge interrupted. I have a copy of a 1973 deed, the 1996 riparian renewal, and the 2023 County Water Board certification. Are you contesting those? Karen's attorney hesitated. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Counterclaim dismissed with prejudice. That was the legal way of saying, you don't get to try that nonsense again. From that point forward, the case became less about whether I was right and more about how much they'd pay for being wrong. We presented every piece of evidence. The video of Karen at the HOA meeting implying my boat was taken care of. Email showing board members pushing for quiet removal. The fire department report confirming accelerant. My own documentation going back years. Tax records, land surveys, repair receipts. The court ruled swiftly. Verdict in favor of the plaintiff. Damages awarded, $248,000, including legal fees, emotional distress, cost of dock repairs, and punitive penalties. But what made it sweeter? The judge issued an additional order. Ridgeview HOA is hereby prohibited from enforcing any rule, citation, or claim over the lakefront parcel or its waters. Jurisdiction rests solely with the titled landowner. Translation? They didn't just lose. They lost forever. Karen didn't show up to the next HOA meeting, but over 60 residents did. By now, they'd received emails from the board announcing a mandatory dues increase to cover legal costs related to recent litigation. Some residents thought it was a joke. One woman stood up and said, "Let me get this straight. You let Karen burn a man's boat, lied about owning the lake, got sued, and now you want us to pay for it." The room exploded. 3 board members resigned on the spot. One guy, who just moved into the neighborhood that year, asked out loud, "Can we get rid of the HOA entirely?" And just like that, the real reckoning began. Karen officially resigned a week later. Her email was short, cold, and unrepentant. Due to ongoing distractions and personal stress, I'm stepping down from my role as president of Ridgeview HOA. I stand by my commitment to community order. No apology, no admission, just ego retreating. A neighbor told me they saw her house go up for sale the next day. Another said she was spotted at the DMV trying to change her plates before leaving town. Whatever her plan was, it didn't involve staying. The HOA scrambled to salvage its reputation. They issued a formal statement acknowledging that the lake had never been part of HOA jurisdiction, that past citations issued for lakefront violations would be rescinded, that board members had acted outside the scope of governance, and that changes were underway to restore trust and transparency. But it was too late. The damage was done, not just financially, but fundamentally, because residents finally realized what Karen's power had been built on. Noise, pressure, bluff. And once that fell apart, so did the HOA's influence. The most poetic moment came from the county recorder's office. They mailed me an official confirmation, stamped, sealed, and indexed. The final plat map update. It read, Lake Parcel ID, sole ownership, protagonist name, no HOA, trust, or cooperative claims recorded. Access, management, and enforcement rights remain 100% private. That record was now public. Anyone with a search bar could find it. The next time an HOA president tried to declare the lake community-controlled, all I had to do was smile and say, "Check the title." The residents began to change, too. People who used to ignore me at the grocery store now waved. A few neighbors sent cards. One left a paddle-shaped keychain on my mailbox that read, "Owned and operated by the lake boss." The HOA was restructured under a new board, younger, quieter, and way more cautious. They rewrote the bylaws, removed lake references completely, and most importantly, they implemented a new rule. No enforcement beyond deeded boundaries. Ever. They learned the hard way that real ownership beats made-up rules. And Karen? She learned the same lesson. With interest. The first thing I did after the dust settled wasn't write a post online or throw a victory party. I rebuilt the dock, plank by plank, nail by nail. The old boards that had been scorched during the fire were removed, replaced with pressure-treated cedar. I repainted the railing, retied the bumpers, and sanded down the ladder until it gleamed like it had when my uncle built it. And then I wheeled in the new paddleboat. It was bigger than the last one, a four-seater, with cup holders and a custom name printed across the stern. Resilient. It glided across the lake with ease, bright blue against the glassy water. Neighbors noticed. Some waved as I floated past. Others left small notes on my gate. "Glad you're still paddling. Lake looks more beautiful than ever. Thanks for standing your ground." But no one tried to find me. No one tried to post a sign. No one told me what belonged where. Because now, they knew. At the edge of the dock, I installed a new sign. Simple, metal, etched in bold lettering. Private waters. By date. Trespassing enforced. Not angry, just clear. A quiet boundary backed by fact, not fear. It wasn't there to intimidate. It was there to remind. Remind anyone who walked by that ownership wasn't about appearance or attitude or community cliques. It was about paper, proof, and principle. The new HOA board reached out soon after they were elected. One of them, a man named Carter, asked to meet by the lakeshore. He apologized, not for what he personally did, but for what the board let happen. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "this won't happen again. Not on our watch." He handed me a signed acknowledgement letter from the new board, affirming that. The lake was private. The HOA relinquished all enforcement claims, and all future disputes would require direct legal consultation. It was the first time in years someone from that group had treated me like a neighbor, not a target. Over the next few months, something shifted. The drama faded. People stopped whispering. Instead of side eyes and silence, I got nods. Conversations. The occasional chat about fishing conditions or tree maintenance. The HOA stopped pretending the lake was theirs. And the community? It started acting like one. Some even joked that the lake was now neutral ground, a symbol of how far things had come. But for me, it was a reminder, a quiet testament that standing your ground, legally and calmly, is sometimes the most powerful move you can make. The lake never looked better, and not just because of the new boat, or the clean dock, or the polished waterline, but because for the first time in years it felt like mine again. Undisputed, undeniable, untouchable, not by ego, not by title chasers, not by self-appointed rulers with burn piles and citations. Just a man, a cabin, and the same water his uncle once paddled across. Sometimes a boat isn't just a boat. It's the last thing they ever try to burn. To the HOA, my paddle boat was just an excuse, a target, something that didn't match their idea of control. But when they lit that fire, they didn't just destroy plastic and paint. They ignited a legal reckoning they couldn't contain. They thought I'd fold, that I'd roll over, pay their fine, and vanish quietly into the background like every other resident they'd pushed around. But what they forgot, or never bothered to check, was the one fact that changed everything. I own the whole damn lake. If someone tries to destroy what's yours, don't fight fire with fire. Fight it with records, with receipts, with law. Because when they sink low, you don't have to scream or break down. You rise with deeds in hand, dates on record, and truth that doesn't bend to intimidation. That's how you win. Not just the battle, but the legacy. And now, that quiet lake, that rebuilt dock, and the boat tied gently to its edge, they stand as reminders, not of what was burned, but of what still stands. Because if they try to burn what floats, you remind them, you still own the water beneath it.